As long as I'm President of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning. I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases. Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken.
So Donald Trump comes out to address the nation after Iranian airstrikes on 2 U.S. bases in Iraq. Now, the airstrikes were in retaliation for the murder, assassination, whatever you want to call it, of General Qasem Soleimani, pronounce his name somewhat off, I'm sorry. But essentially a war hero, a fighter of ISIS, and you, to some degree, can get the significance of this act based on the number of people, the millions of people that came out to grieve, and not just grieve, but also to show anger and resentment at what was an outright blatant act of war. I don't know what else you can call it other than that. If there was anybody else, meaning if there was somebody here in the United States, any of our Congress members, if they were drone struck, even if they were guilty of war crimes by the Iranian government, we would be willing to go to war. It's weird that we don't think the same in reverse. After Trump assassinated, which is against the law, the member of their government, we all knew that Iran was going to retaliate. It was unclear as to how. And there was this kind of weird energy in the air, in the sense, this notion that, okay, something is going to pop off. We just don't know where it's going to pop off, and we don't know the severity of it. Because the moment that Trump did that, it was out of his hands. What I mean by out of his hands, yes, the president has some level of agency, but ultimately, if Iran, depending on how they responded, Donald Trump would have no agency in that process at all. He would have to respond in kind, in a dramatic escalation, meaning the killing of Qasem Soleimani could have set off a series of events that could have landed this world into a war. And it is unclear on how Russia and China would have responded. It's unclear on how this is dramatically dangerous. That's my point. Iran responded in almost somewhat of a token attack. Now, I say token because Iran has the capacity to hit back much harder. They could have hit back at Saudi Arabia. They could have hit back at Israel. They could have targeted American personnel with a far larger barrage of missiles. They could have targeted with more sophisticated missiles. I'm making the point that they had capacities that they did not dispose themselves of. This attack was in order to satisfy the will of the population to do something. The government couldn't just stand by and allow that killing to take place. They had to respond in kind. And in responding in kind, they decided to go along a plan of action that would allow an attack to take place without necessarily killing any American personnel. My point is, this was intentionally done this way. Iran even notified the Iraqis, who clearly was going to notify the Americans that the attack was on the way so they can get out of Dodge. This early warning system, I don't know what that is. I do know they were early warned by Iran themselves. So it doesn't seem like Iran was trying to necessarily kill anybody in this attack. Here's the catch. What Donald Trump just said here, though, is not true. Come to find out, it was disclosed yesterday well, today, but yesterday, that there were 11 casualties associated with that strike, meaning the damage of that strike was more significant than what the U.S. was initially telling. Let's talk about it, because this is somewhat of a big disclosure. And I want to explain why this is a big disclosure. And to some degree, I think, well, let's talk about it on the other side. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal, Patreon. This video will be instantly demonetized, so it is brought to you by you. We like to say even $1 helps. I was following this missile strike because I got to be honest, I was outraged by our country outright assassinating, not to mention the breach of sovereignty of Iraq in and of itself, but the outright murder of a member of a foreign government. Now, we knew Iran was going to respond. Iran responded with a barrage of missiles. There's varying accounts to how many. I think they said the U.S. says like 14. Iran says more. But nevertheless, what matters is Iran launches missiles at the United States bases. And again, just so you can hear what Trump says here.
Casualties, all of our soldiers, the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained.
Now again, that's not true, and the language is somewhat slippery on one point. What does minimal damage mean? Is there a standard by which we register damage, or is it a subjective term? And if it's indeed a subjective term, what does minimum damage means? It does seem that the damage was a little bit more extensive than what we were initially telling. But again, this all hinges on the term extensive. Whereas this can be somewhat subjective, so fair enough. This is the images of the damages that took place. You could see on one side these bases being essentially demolished. This is what it looked like prior. This is what it looks like now. This entire building is gone. It says something about taxiways. So there was damage. Again, it hinges on what does the term significant mean as opposed to minor. More important here, though, is Donald Trump said there were no casualties. There was nobody that was injured. All of our people were great. We had an early warning system. Come to find out, there were 11 casualties. Now, casualty doesn't necessarily mean dead. It just means injury. This is multiple sources reporting this. U.S. troops were injured by Iran missile strike, despite Pentagon initially saying there were no casualties. Politico. 11 U.S. troops evacuated from Iraq base after Trump claimed none were harmed. CENTCOM comes out and puts out a statement that makes the point that there were some people who were evacuated to Kuwait and Germany to deal with injuries as a result of this missile strike. Now, on top of that, they try to explain the discrepancy by saying the reason there was a discrepancy is because many of these guys, some of them went back to work, and we did our initial check, but apparently the symptoms that they might have experienced didn't necessarily go anywhere. It's concussive force injuries. Yeah, concussive force injuries. So they were making the point that, look, the damages were still being assessed. We gave an initial preliminary report on this stuff, but ultimately the people who were there, they were experiencing problems and they had to get subsequent checks. That's basically what it boils down to. It wasn't that we were lying about it. It was just that the person who was there, the commander at the time, his initial assessment came out with X. After further review, we found out that there were people who were injured based on the blast. Now, what's true? Is it a lie or was it a preliminary report? Now, One of the things that you would notice with Trump here is bravado. Chest poked out. Iran would never get a missile. It seems that Iran is de-escalating, and et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, we killed a terrorist. This was their response. It's a good thing that they're de-escalating, or else. It's that type of thing. Now, part of the reason is military conflicts and war is not just about material advantage. Meaning this person has more tanks or bombs or boats, yes, but that's not the entirety, end-all and be-all. Environment creates behavior, morale. The perspective of the individual, meaning the people who are fighting those wars, the perspective of the government itself, the perspective of your capabilities in relation to your enemy's capabilities. All of those things play into this conversation of war. Part of the reason why I told you that be very skeptical of anything that's coming out of these two countries is because these two countries are, for the most part, in conflict with one another. And oftentimes, media tends to go in line with the government's narrative when it's in opposition to a country that we deem to be running afoul of us. So, the United States, in this case, Donald Trump, before this, puts out this tweet where he threatens to destroy cultural centers in Iran. At least I had the tweet up. Well, Trump puts out a tweet threatening to destroy cultural centers in Iran. Now, here we are. This is grossly illegal. Right here. Iran is talking very boldly about targeting certain U.S. assets for revenge for our ridding the world of a terrorist leader who had just killed an American. We don't know that. We don't know that at all. That's just what Trump's saying. He was already attacking an embassy and preparing for additional hits to other locations. Esper, Defense Secretary, said that's not true. He has no knowledge of that. Iran has been nothing but a problem for many years. Let this serve as a warning that if Iran strikes any Americans or any American assets, we have targeted 52 Iranian sites. My point is, he's putting out threats before this, essentially drawing somewhat of a line in the sand of, we will do this. We have all of these sites targeted. If you strike us, we will do X or Y, especially if any American is killed or injured. Yeah, Americans are assets. Well, Americans were struck. And no, like I said, the objective wasn't necessarily to kill or injure or kill Americans. But they were injured. There were casualties. What the Pentagon and what Trump was saying beforehand turned out not to be true. Now, why though? Now, the truth of the matter is that Donald Trump seems to have continuously de-escalated before ever getting to the point of crossing into the breach. This assassination of Qasem Soleimani was probably the closest that he has been to getting this country into a war, because this was a situation that was entirely out of his hands. If Iran responded in a particular way, Donald Trump would have had no recourse but to respond, dragging these countries into war. My point is, if you would have reported these casualties on the day of, Iran strikes back. Iran makes the point that if you don't do anything else from here, we'll stop. Meaning we won't go further. This is just a proportional response. We're trying to break even. Trump, in this case, though, gets out here and essentially says he de-escalates. Now, yes, he's acting like a guerrilla when he's de-escalating and he's saying some pretty horrible things. But from a substance standpoint, he de-escalates. Iran gets their strikes. Trump doesn't respond to those strikes. But what does the media cycle look like, though, if Iran makes their strikes? And instead of Donald Trump coming out here and saying, there were no casualties, there were no injuries, there was just minimal damage, essentially, we were untouched. What if he comes out and said there were 11 casualties? There were 11 Americans that were injured by the Iranian strikes. Does Trump have the political latitude and the leeway to essentially pull back and de-escalate? it becomes somewhat more difficult to do the moment that you say there are American casualties in it. It doesn't matter that Trump was the one that initiated all this. Doesn't matter that all of this was Trump's fault in regards to the decisions that he made. The media would look at this as if Iran was being provocative. And it wasn't Iran at all that was being provocative. It was Trump. The catch here, though, is in one case after the next, Donald Trump has pulled himself back from the brink. Even when everybody else around him was saying, you got to do strikes, you got to do strikes. Trump has always avoided that. He is engaging in this pressure strategy that is going to ultimately fail because there's no leeway for negotiation in this context with Iran after he's burned them and after he's murdered their general. But this pressure strategy where he wants to pressure but not necessarily drag the country into a larger war. The catch here is the people who are around him and giving advice don't have those issues. Those are not issues for people like Bolton. I know Bolton is not necessarily there, but this strategy that he's taken is still, for the most part, out of the same playbook. Pompeo, I would imagine, has no issue with this toppling the government. I would imagine Giuliani has no issue with toppling the government. I'm making the point that there are people around him that are giving him advice that regardless of what he wants, they are dragging him closer and closer and closer to a conflict. You don't believe me? Look at where we are now and think back to just a year ago. It's dramatically different. It's not just a proxy war anymore. It is us killing their people and them responding from their country to attack our assets. And in this particular exchange, this could have gone dramatically haywire. If Donald Trump has to explain that there are casualties on the day of the strikes, it becomes far more difficult to allow political latitude for him to back away from the brink. Is it possible that knowing this, they decided to take a political thing of there were no casualties, everybody was great? Now, think back to the Afghanistan papers, the papers that was released by the Washington Post. Flagrant lying by the presidents of the United States in regards to issues of war. In this specific case, Afghanistan. Leon Panetta, there's a scene in it that's so ludicrous. Leon Panetta nearly gets killed by a suicide bombing and still comes out and tells the press everything is going great, we're making progress. We're making progress. It was all lies. My point here is the same thing can be true with this. When Obama killed bin Laden, what happened? He comes out and he says, he gives multiple stories. The story starts to shift. Well, our intelligence, we found him. And then later on, you found out somebody came into the embassy and essentially pointed out bin Laden was in Pakistan. Pakistan did not want the United States to disclose that. They wanted the United States to keep that a secret. Hence, the initial cover story of our intelligence is just spot on. We were able to find him. We found a little pinprick, in the middle of the desert, and that's where he is. The other story about him being in Pakistan and Pakistan authorities allowing the United States to get into the country in order to kill him. I mean, for fuck's sake, they had enough time to crash a helicopter, blow the helicopter up, kill bin Laden, drag his corpse off of the, this was not something that was a short time span, especially since there was a naval academy or a military academy in Pakistan that was nearby. My point is, they lied in order to cover the story itself. I don't see why this would be any different, especially if Donald Trump's intention was not necessarily to drag the country into a war. Whether he wants to drag the country into a war or not is kind of besides the point. It's escalating to a degree where he is not, as I've said before, at some point, he is not going to be able to back away. I'll end this here. Like, share, subscribe, and Wesley Walker. World's #1 terrorist, my ass. America's public didn't know that this guy existed, right, till 3 weeks ago. Killed with impunity all over the world, and just by labeling anyone we don't like a terrorist. Yes, that's exactly what it is. Terrorist is a relational term. Like, the United States considers anybody that's running afoul of what it's doing as a terrorist. By the way, they're calling him a terrorist for political reasons. Ultimately, assassination is against our laws. And because assassination is against the law, even when they killed bin Laden, Obama, there's an awesome article in the New York Times where Obama is coming up with legal justifications. He's getting his lawyers to come up with legal justifications in order to kill bin Laden. It was an assassination. He understood it was an assassination. He was trying to deal with the legal problems with it. In this particular case, Trump didn't care about any of that stuff. And the way he's trying to dodge this is just by saying he's a terrorist. And because he's a terrorist, he fits under whatever rules of engagement we have for killing people we deem to be terrorists. Under that model, under that argument, then every military leader across the world is a terrorist because all of these things are relational and all of these guys have blood on their hands. The notion that we're going to say this guy is a terrorist, that's mind-blowing. Whatever you want to think of him, whatever you want to think of the roadside bombs and all that stuff, be honest. We invaded a country on a lie. We were responsible for the deaths of nearly 1 million people in that country, not to mention the displacement, not to mention the hardship, not to mention the destruction of public services, the loss of jobs, security, all of that stuff. And in doing so, you had resistance movements that tried to push back the occupiers, who just so happen to be us. Now, how can you get mad at people who are trying to push you out of a country that you have illegally and wrongly invaded? Like, I understand, like, it's personal when somebody gets injured by like a roadside bomb or something to that effect. Fair enough, but your issue and your gripe here is not with him. Your issue is with your country that dragged you into that senseless war. I mean, this note that the guy's a terrorist, the guy's a terrorist. Like, terrorists don't get 6 million people coming to their funeral. They just typically don't. The guy was a general. The guy was a war hero by their own standards. The guy was a fighter of ISIS, even by CNN's own standards. CNN ran that story on more than one occasion about him fighting ISIS, the person who fights ISIS. Trump, there was no imminent attack. Trump just murdered him. Pompeo said there was an imminent attack, but we don't know when. Think about what that means. Temporally speaking, we know that there's an attack that's going to take place because it's imminent. However, despite it being imminent, meaning in a short span of time, it's a temporal quantity, we don't know when, which is another temporal quantity. He's impeaching himself just in the way that he's talking about Pompeo. And Trump, look, there was no imminent threat. And Esper himself even comes out saying that what Trump was saying, he has no specific information related to what Trump is saying. Trump is just lying through his teeth. You can look at him and tell. There was no imminent attack. The president of the United States just murdered somebody. He leveraged our military, an apparatus that is supposed to be used in the defense of this country, to just murder somebody and then claim that the guy is a terrorist. This should be worrisome. I'm sorry. I mean, like, when Obama destroyed Libya, that should have been worrisome. When Trump outright, flagrantly just murders somebody in this way that's a member of somebody else's government, literally an act of war, that should be worrisome. I'm always amazed that the American public looks at this stuff with a, like they don't get that people are dying or that people are being blown up or that communities have been destroyed. It's fucking weird to me. If the roles were reversed, like, I couldn't imagine the response of the United States as the roles were reversed in that situation. This attack was a token attack in order to just try to satisfy some level of public discontent over the murder of Qasem Soleimani, or General Soleimani. Their objective was not to kill. Their objective was essentially a token leveling up of sorts. There is no leveling up in that process. I think I said it before, in trying to be strong, where there's weakness masquerading as strength. Irrational actors, they don't want a war. All right, like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.